Custom bike features at production bike prices. That is the promise of the Jamis Renegade S2 that I'm going to review today. Find out what I like and dislike about it in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you're into gravel riding and the non-competitive side of cycling, riding party pace, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. A couple of disclaimers before we hop right into it. This bike was provided for review, but I am not keeping it. I'm sending it back, and all the thoughts and opinions are my own. Also, as you are seeing it here in the video, it's not completely stock. I did have to swap out the saddle and the handlebars to make it fit. The Renegade S2 is the steel frame carbon fork version of the Renegade line from Jamis. The MSRP on this bike is about $2,100, which I know is not cheap, but when you look at what you get, actually is pretty good value. Starting off with the frame, it is a branded steel, in this case Reynolds 631. 2 nubbins on the top for a top tube bag. 3-pack mount on the down tube for adjustability of the water bottle cage, nice touch. Water bottle cage on the bottom of the down tube and one on the seat tube. The bike also has eyelets for a rear rack and fenders, so you can ride it either sporty or more utilitarian. The bottom bracket is a threaded T47, so much better than press fit, but not as standard as the standard BSA 68 bottom bracket standard. So many standards. The fork is carbon and it's got 3-pack mounts. According to Jamis, the stated weight load for the fork is 25 pounds. I don't think I'd ever personally put that much on there. I'd probably keep it fairly light. And like most carbon forks, I wouldn't assume that you could run a rando rack or a basket packing rig on there. Probably best to stick to lighter weight anything cages, adventure cage mount things. One unique thing that Jamis does do on this bike that I don't think a lot of brands do is that they adjust the rake throughout the size range. So as the bikes get bigger and smaller, they adjust that fork offset so the resultant trail is generally the same. What that means is if you're riding a small size like the size 51, it doesn't have a super high trail and rides more like a mountain bike, but will still generally feel like a bike in the middle of the range, say like a size 55 or a 56. Interestingly, this smaller size 51 did come with 700C wheels and tires. In this case, some Stans Crest rims, mated to some WTB Radlers in 700 by 40. I would have thought personally that with a size 51 that it should come with 650B to help prevent toe overlap. I did notice that on some really tight slow speed turns, my toe was starting to tap that front wheel. Looking at the cockpit, it comes stock with some Ritchie handlebars and a stem. The Ritchie bars it came with are more road oriented. I did have to swap it out for the Redshift kitchen sink, which added a little bit more rise since this bike was on the small side for me. The controls are the very excellent Shimano GRX. I just think they have the best lever feel in the business right now. Brakes are flat mount disc brakes, and in terms of the drivetrain, you've got a GRX crank in the front with a 40-tooth chainring, and in the back, a GRX rear derailleur with an 11 to 42 tooth cassette, 11-speed. If you're a fan of the channel, you know what I'm going to say. I think personally that this bike is overgeared for what it promises to do. The lowest gear is just barely 1-to-1. And I think if you're going to use this bike as a lightly loaded tourer or a bike packing bike, you're going to want more low than what it comes stock with. So that either means changing out the front chainring or working out some mullet hack where you can get an 11 to 46 or 11 to 50 in the rear. Also stock with this build is a carbon seat post. I did swap out the saddle. It came with a Cell Royale asphalt. Didn't quite work with my anatomy, so I swapped it out to one of my favorites, and that is a ergon saddle. One thing you'll notice is that the bike has a sloping top tube. I know that's kind of divisive. Some people like it nice and level, but one advantage of the sloping top tube is that I actually got some flex from the carbon seat post. Usually because of my short legs, I don't have much post showing, so I can put a carbon seat post on there and I can't really feel it because there's just not enough post exposed to flex. But with this sloping top tube, I actually get a nice little bit of suspension in the rear. Total weight on our scales for the bike was about 25 pounds. Definitely not the lightest bike, but not the heaviest bike within this price range for this style of bike. So enough of the specs and the boring stuff. How did this bike ride? So the bike has a relatively tucked in rear end with a chainstay length of about 427. And for me, it felt about par for course in that all-rounder category. Maybe the slightliest bit spicy, but generally a well-rounded rear end. In terms of the front, the calculated trail was about 64. So this is in that kind of upper end of endurance road bike. Interestingly, for me, when I rode it with the 700C tires, it did feel a little bit higher trail than the number would suggest. It might be that I'm just used to the feel of smaller wheels and tires at this point, and anything 700C just feels higher trail. What that means in terms of the ride, it was super predictable in the steering and the handling. I could ride it pretty easily no-handed, and the general sensation of the bike in the front end was more or less neutral. Climbing out of the saddle were some really spirited efforts. It was fairly responsive, not quite as zippy as a full-on road bike, but definitely a lot more oomph than you would get from a touring bike. So I guess all-rounder with a bit of spiciness added to it. On slow, steep seated climbs, the front end was fairly well behaved. It didn't wander too much with too much wheel flop, aka drunken goatiness. And descending on the bike was actually a surprisingly smooth and stable experience. So in terms of handling, a pretty neutral handling bike to me. Little sparkles of quickness here and there, but nothing super exotic. I think it's a good representation or expression of a all-rounder bike with like that slightest bit of zing to it. I did put 650B wheels and tires on this bike for a hot minute. Definitely check out that video, but short version is that it added a little bit more liveliness to the bike. What do I like and dislike about it? I think at $2,200, although again, it's not free or cheap, when you look at other bikes in that price range, you get a little bit more value for the money. You get some branded steel, a carbon fork, true through axles, and flat mount brakes if that's important to you, as opposed to something like the Surly Midnight Special, but from a pure componentry perspective, doesn't offer as much value. It does have a little bit spicier geometry, the Midnight Special. I think that's what you're paying for, but the Jamis, in terms of a solid, good value, good spec'd out bike for the price, it does really well, even when compared to things like the Salsa Warbird. In fact, this bike very reminiscent of the Warbird. If you've always wanted a Warbird but wanted a steel frame, this will definitely scratch that itch. Another big like is utility. It's got 3-pack mounts. It's got eyelets for fenders and a rear rack. I like the triple bosses on the down tube because that allows you to position your bottle cage, make room for a half frame bag if that's how you roll. In terms of design and utility, I think it's fairly well thought out. Another big plus is tire clearance. You can see with the 700x40, there's lots of room in there. In 650B, you can go up supposedly to 2.2. I didn't quite test that. I did put in 650B by 47s, and yeah, there seemed like there's plenty of clearance. In terms of downsides, you know, these are kind of personal preferences, but the handlebars wasn't generally a fan of. They picked a Ritchie handlebar that was more road oriented. I feel like a bike like this would have been better served with something like the Ritchie Venture Max. Also, the saddle wasn't a big fan, a little bit on the narrower side for me. So in that way, the spec was a little bit incongruent because, you know, the overall design and purpose of the bike, screams grab, but they put roadie components on the front and on the saddle. Another downside is, you know, the S2 gets a lot right with their size-specific design, but I do think it was a little bit of an odd choice that the size 51 came shipped with a 700x40, and where I think once the bikes start to get this small, 650B would probably be the better size to avoid things like toe overlap. So who is this bike for? I think this makes a great all-arounder road bike. If you're looking for something that looks like a road bike but isn't, you know, super duper aggressive and racy, then this bike could be all the bike you could ever need. Swap out the Rattlers for something a little bit smoother tread, and it would make an awesome commuter. I could see that this bike would also be a great light duty bike tour or bike packing bike, as long as you fiddle with the gearing so it works for your terrain. And of course you can ride it on the Grav. This could honestly be the one bike quiver killer for most people. It's not the most exotic in terms of geometry or design, but it is a good execution of a all-rounder, all-road bike. That's what I think. Let me know what you think. Have any of you guys been riding the Jamis Renegade series? Would love to hear your long-term thoughts on the platform. If you have any questions, leave those in the comments below. And if you like this review, definitely check out the almost 100 other bike reviews I've done on the channel. And if you haven't already, definitely check out our web store where you can pick up some Party Paste merch to help support the channel so I can keep making videos and all this other good stuff. As always, keep the supple side down.